Thanks for stopping by to check out yet another fun-filled, action-packed episode of Vintage Audio Review. In this episode, I'm going to talk about this Conrad Johnson MF-200 amplifier. In 1990, this sold for $1,995, which would be about $4,500 today. It's rated at 200 watts per channel into 8 ohms, both channels driven, at less than 1% THD, and had a frequency response of plus 0 dB to minus 0.25 dB from 20 Hz to 20 kilohertz. It weighs a lofty 59 pounds. There is only the power on-off button in the front, and we do have rack mounting handles, and we have kind of this nice golden finish to it. I'm going to flip around the back and we'll see what's going on there. This obviously is the rear of the Conrad Johnson MF-200. We do have gold-plated unbalanced RCA input jacks there. We do have fuses for each channel's power supplies here and here. We do have 4-way speaker binding posts there that are banana jack friendly, of course. And we do have a main line fuse here. And one cannot help but notice these large heat sinks in the back of it, which the MOSFETs are mounted to. So here we have the MF-200 with the cover removed, and the first thing that grabs my attention is this massive power supply transformer. Underneath this circuit board here are the big filter capacitors, and we'll see those in a moment. This circuit board here would be the driver stage for the right channel, and here are some of the FETs for the right channel, and the other 3 FETs are over on this side. And if we come over to here, we can see 3 of the FETs for the left channel as well. This is the left channel circuit board. Should look the same. It's just a little bit different viewpoint, and you can see, I think, just the tinge of the filter capacitors. If I move this around a little bit more, and in this view you have a clear view of the filter capacitors that are used. There's also more capacitors underneath here. You can kind of just see them, and that's kind of a layout of this monstrous power amp. Our first piece of data is the standard 1 kilohertz THD SNR plot with the Conrad Johnson putting out about 5 watts into 8 ohm loads. The SNR looks really good. We'll call it 95 dB, and the THD is, we'll call it 0.06 dB. That's pretty darn good. The THD plus noise is a little bit higher than other ones, but 65 dB is not so bad. One big thing to note is that we're only putting out 25 dB of gain, where most amplifiers have 29 dB of gain. So this tells you you probably would want a preamp that is capable of putting out a little bit higher voltage level. And here we have the frequency response with the Conrad Johnson putting out 5 watts into 8 ohms, and it's looking fairly flat, maybe down 0.4 of a dB at 20 kilohertz, and maybe 0.1 of a dB at 20 hertz. Overall, the channels are balanced within maybe a little over 1/10 of a dB, so it's looking pretty decent. This is an extended frequency response plot where we're plotting out to 40 kilohertz, and basically it's only down 0.7 of a dB or so at 26 kilohertz, so it does have a very good frequency response. And here's the multitone plot showing 12 to 13 bits of distortion-free range. Here we have the MF-200 putting out 5 watts into 4 ohms, and its performance is a little bit less than it was under the same conditions into 8 ohms, but still not bad. This plot shows the output impedance of the MF-200. You can easily calculate the damping factor if you divide 8 by the impedance. So in this case, the worst case impedance is like 0.36 ohms for the right channel at 20 kilohertz, which equates to a damping factor of 22. If you took the normal impedance for the right channel, which is about 0.2 ohms,
it would equate to a damping factor of about 40, which is decent. Here we have the frequency response of the MF-200, putting out 5 watts into 4 ohms, and it is looking like it's down about 1 dB at 25 kilohertz. Not quite as good as the 8 ohm lung case, but it's still not too bad. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the MF-200 putting out 200 watts into 8 ohms, both channels driven. It is meeting the less than 1% THD requirement. There isn't really a spec for the SNR, but at around 90 dB, that's not too bad at this power level. The THD plus noise in the mid-50s is nothing to write home about, but there was not a specification for it. For grins and giggles, I am putting up the THD SNR plot for the Carver M500T, also putting out 200 watts into 8 ohms, or a little bit more than that. And this amplifier is 5 years older and cost a quarter of a price of the Conrad Johnson. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz for the MF-200 putting out 300 watts into 4 ohms, both channels driven. And it doesn't look a lot different than it did when it was doing 200 watts into 8 ohms. Here I was trying to recreate some old test data where they had put in a 35 hertz signal and the first harmonic, which would be at 70 hertz, was down 77 dB. In our case, we're down 58.6 dB. This is a plot of the THD versus frequency for a couple different power levels, and this would be with the MF-200 into 4 ohm loads. And you can tell that it is meeting the less than 1% THD requirement for all cases. And in fact, it looks really good from about 20 hertz or maybe 40 hertz on up. It's less than 0.2 or 0.3%. So overall, the distortion looks really good into a 4 ohm load. And here we have another THD versus frequency at a couple different power levels, but this time we're looking into 8 ohm loads, and we are better than the less than 1% THD maximum requirement. The data doesn't look quite as tight as it was with the 4 ohm load situation, but it still looks pretty good across the band. This plot shows the crosstalk or isolation between the left and right channels with a signal applied to the left channel input, and the right channel input is terminated into a short, and what we're seeing is the bleed through of the left channel on into the right channel signal path. There was not really a specification for this, however, some old data, it did show that the isolation was typically 80 dB, and at 20 kilohertz it was 59 dB. We can see that we're about 50 dB at 20 kilohertz, and we're down maybe 70 dB through most of the band, except for the peak around 60 hertz, which is from the bleed through from the power supply.
As you saw from the data, the Conrad Johnson MF-200 did a pretty good job of meeting most of its nearly 32-year-old specifications. In fact, its THD was much less than the specification throughout most of the testing. For listening, I hooked it up to my KEF 107s using the Carver C1 preamplifier and listened to the gamut of music that I normally do. And it did a very good job. As far as the sound of the MF-200, I thought it sounded really nice, and in particular, I thought it did a pretty good job with the bass reproduction on some of my heavier bass tracks that I play. It never became stressed, and I did crank it up to about 2/3 volume, which was probably in the 110, 120 watt peaks into 4 ohms. I was reaching 92 dB SPLs for a while, and typically in the mid-80 SPLs, and the max temperature of the MF-200 was maybe 115 degrees, and it would be more on the left channel here. This guy seemed a little bit warmer than the right channel, but that it never was too hot to touch, so that was good. So when the MF-200 was powered on, I did hear a small little thump, not really distracting, but some amplifiers exhibit no thumps, and this one had a little thump. That was the only sort of observation I have that might be construed as negative. There was no turn off thumps at all. And with both the inputs to the MF-200 shorted, I did not hear any sound coming out of the tweeter mid-range area of either speaker, so it was basically quiet. After I had finished listening to the Conrad Johnson, I went and hooked up my Soundcraftsman PCR 800, which I reviewed a few videos back. It's also a 200 watt into 8 ohm amplifier that costs a fraction of what the Conrad Johnson did new. And I enjoyed the sound of the PCR 800. Now, I didn't change any controls, and when I powered on the Soundcraftsman, it had a much louder sound because it has 29 dB of gain or so, whereas the Conrad Johnson is around 25 dB gain. So I just backed down the volume control. I was hitting 92 dB SPLs with the Soundcraftsman. One of the clipping LEDs was coming on, but I was not hearing any distortion at all. And I think the bass was just a little bit less than the Conrad Johnson, but I thought the mid-range high end of the Soundcraftsman sounded a little bit better, which is unusual for me to say, but that just was my impression of it. I would have preferred listening to the Soundcraftsman over the Conrad Johnson. At some point, I hope to have the ability to do some A/B comparisons between power amplifiers, but my quick impression was that the Soundcraftsman sounded better, at least to my taste. Other than that, I would be very happy to own this amplifier, and I would imagine it can drive most any speaker that's thrown at it. And I would like to thank my friends Richard and Ian for allowing me to test this amplifier. Once again, if you like this video, please click the like button, and if you have not subscribed, that would be nice if you would hit the subscribe button, and I hope that you will have a great day or night.